At Old Dominion Medical Center in Richmond, Virginia, there existed a pristine silence that cloaked the halls like a veil, an aura that conveyed the hospital's reputation as a sanctuary of healing and expertise. The facility was renowned across the state for its excellence in medicine, yet few understood the complex web of tensions simmering beneath its sterile surface. This veneer of professionalism concealed a realm of unspoken rivalries, silent judgments, and, for one particular nurse named Althea Thompson, a daunting struggle against prejudice. Althea, a recent hire at Old Dominion, had come to Virginia in search of stability and purpose. Raised by a single mother who had worked as a nurse herself, Althea had spent her youth in an impoverished neighborhood in Baltimore, a place where healthcare was more luxury than right. She had dreamed of becoming a nurse to bridge that gap, to offer her skills to anyone in need, regardless of their background. Her mother's words echoed in her mind often. "You carry a legacy, Althea. Don't let anyone diminish it." And for years, Althea had honored this legacy, graduating top of her class and excelling in her residency. When the opportunity came to join Old Dominion, it seemed like a step toward her goals, a place where her skills and dedication would be acknowledged. Yet from her first day, Althea sensed something unsettling about Old Dominion. While the initial introductions were polite, the subtle glances and whispered exchanges among her colleagues suggested otherwise. Her arrival was met with an atmosphere of scrutiny, as though her every movement was under observation, judged against invisible standards she could never satisfy. Althea's sense of unease only deepened as days passed, but she dismissed it, determined to prove herself through hard work. The head nurse, an elderly woman named Margot Tillman, oversaw the nursing staff with a strict hand. Margot had served Old Dominion for nearly 30 years, embodying the hospital's expectations of tradition and standard. When Althea first introduced herself, Margot's nod was curt, her expression betraying nothing. However, a barely perceptible tightening of her mouth, as Althea mentioned her experience in Baltimore, hinted at her real feelings. Despite this, Althea held her head high, refusing to let assumptions or stereotypes define her place in the hospital. Among the doctors was Dr. Peter Hastings, a senior physician with a reputation for both brilliance and intimidation. Known for his cold, unyielding demeanor, Dr. Hastings commanded respect and obedience in equal measure. He often spoke with a tone that bordered on disdain, especially when addressing nurses he deemed beneath his intellectual standing. With his salt and pepper hair and sharply pressed lab coat, he resembled the epitome of medical authority, a figure few dared to question. It was on Althea's third week at Old Dominion that she encountered Dr. Hastings in a way that would mark the beginning of her battle with the unspoken prejudice that thrived within the hospital's walls. The morning began like any other, with Althea completing her rounds and checking in on patients under her care. As she moved through the hallways, nodding politely to her colleagues, she felt the usual prickle of sidelong glances and faint murmurs trailing behind her. These whispers had become a daily fixture at Old Dominion, an invisible fog that clouded her every interaction, reminding her that her presence was still regarded with skepticism. When she reached room 214, her steps faltered. Dr. Hastings stood at the patient's bedside, meticulously reviewing a chart. His brow was furrowed, his expression unreadable, as he studied the patient. A frail elderly man named Raymond Grayson, who had been admitted the previous night with severe chest pains. Althea waited at the door, instinctively aware that Dr. Hastings didn't appreciate interruptions. His back was turned, but she knew he sensed her presence. There was a slight stiffening in his posture. After a few tense seconds, Dr. Hastings turned around, his gaze cold and analytical. His eyes flickered over her, lingering for a moment on her name badge, before his lips curled into a tight line. The silence between them was palpable, and Althea felt an uncomfortable chill trickling down her spine. Dr. Hastings didn't address her directly, but instead looked past her, speaking in a clipped, dispassionate tone as he handed her the chart. He issued instructions for Mr. Grayson's medication and outlined a series of tests, but his words carried an air of dismissal, as if her mere presence was an inconvenience. Althea listened intently, maintaining her composure, though she sensed his barely concealed condescension. When he finished, he looked at her with a detached finality. as if she were no more than an interchangeable cog in the machinery of the hospital. As the day wore on, Althea's encounters with Dr. Hastings became increasingly unsettling. She noticed the way he scrutinized her work with an intensity he reserved only for her, as if waiting for her to make the slightest error. Each time she administered medication or checked a patient's vitals, his gaze followed her with a calculating, clinical disinterest, assessing her competence as if it were a foregone conclusion that she would fall short. The silent scrutiny weighed heavily on Althea's mind, but she persevered, drawing strength from the memory of her mother's words. She completed her tasks with precision, each movement a quiet defiance against the dismissive treatment she received. But Dr. Hastings was relentless. He assigned her to the most difficult cases, knowing they required a level of patience and resilience that he doubted she possessed. One afternoon, Dr. Hastings approached her with yet another challenging assignment. Althea's heart sank as he handed her the patient file without a word, his eyes reflecting a glint of unspoken judgment. The file belonged to Thomas Edwards, a new admission who, according to the notes, had suffered a serious injury during a hiking trip. Althea read the details, noting that Mr. Edwards had multiple fractures and required extensive care. The assignment felt like another test, a deliberate attempt to overwhelm her, but Althea accepted it with quiet resolve. Entering Mr. Edwards' room, Althea was greeted by the sight of a middle-aged man with both legs in casts and a calm, discerning expression. Unlike most patients, he didn't appear defeated by his circumstances. There was an air of quiet authority about him, a sense of someone used to observing and evaluating those around him. Althea introduced herself with her usual warmth and began her assessment, methodically checking his vitals and noting his responses. As the days passed, Althea noticed that Mr. Edwards was more observant than any patient she'd encountered. He asked questions about her background, her journey to Old Dominion, and her experiences at the hospital, his tone always laced with a genuine curiosity. He seemed unfazed by her professionalism, a stark contrast to the dismissive glances she received from her colleagues. In his presence, Althea felt seen, not as a target for scrutiny, but as a capable, dedicated nurse. Dr. Hastings, however, seemed to relish the opportunity to undermine her, particularly with Mr. Edwards. Each time Althea entered his room to administer medication or attend to his needs, Dr. Hastings would appear shortly afterward, inspecting her work with a thinly veiled disdain. Althea could feel his skepticism as he reviewed her notes and observed her interactions with Mr. Edwards, his disapproval manifesting in a series of curt, passive-aggressive instructions. One evening, as Althea was preparing to end her shift, she overheard a conversation between Dr. Hastings and a group of nurses. His tone was icy, laced with a derision she recognized all too well. "She's here because of some diversity quota," he muttered, his words carrying a weight that settled like lead in Althea's chest. "It's no wonder she struggles with the more complex cases. The standards we used to uphold have clearly fallen." The words cut deep, piercing through Althea's defenses. She had endured countless microaggressions throughout her career, but this was different. A blatant dismissal of her competence, her dedication, her very worth as a nurse. Althea felt a surge of anger and hurt, but she bit down the emotions, refusing to let them consume her. Yet, beneath the surface, a slow-burning determination was kindling within her. She had come too far, worked too hard to let one man's prejudice diminish her. The thought of her mother's legacy steeled her resolve, reminding her of the strength she carried within. And as she walked away from the conversation, Althea knew that she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for every nurse who had been judged, dismissed, or overlooked because of factors beyond their control. The following morning, Althea's interactions with Dr. Hastings grew colder, his demeanor increasingly hostile as he assigned her yet another complex task with Mr. Edwards. But unbeknownst to Dr. Hastings, Mr. Edwards had been observing these interactions with a discerning eye. He noted the subtle slights, the dismissive glances, and the relentless undermining, piecing together the troubling dynamics of Old Dominion. And in silence, he resolved to take action. Over the next few days, the tension between Althea and Dr. Hastings became a near-constant undercurrent at Old Dominion. Althea maintained her professionalism, though the weight of Dr. Hastings's disdain felt like a stone pressing down on her. She endured his scrutiny, his constant corrections, and the extra workload he seemed determined to pile onto her. Each moment felt like a test, as though he were daring her to falter. For Mr. Edwards, however, these moments held a different significance. From his hospital bed, he watched the interactions unfold with increasing interest. He sensed the unease in Althea's stance, the rigidness in her movements whenever Dr. Hastings was near, and he noted the underlying tension that pervaded the hospital staff's behavior toward her. The pattern was unmistakable, and Mr. Edwards could no longer remain a passive observer. Late one evening, as Althea completed her rounds, she found herself once again attending to Mr. Edwards. She entered his room with her usual composed expression, though the exhaustion in her eyes was hard to miss. Mr. Edwards, perceptive as always, noticed her wariness. He observed the careful way she handled his chart, the precision with which she documented each detail, her professionalism evident in every movement. Mr. Edwards' gaze followed her as she worked, a silent acknowledgement of her dedication. She had become accustomed to his presence, his watchful eyes a source of comfort amidst the otherwise hostile atmosphere. Althea found herself relying on these moments of quiet support, a reminder that someone within the hospital walls saw her as more than just an object of scrutiny. But Dr. Hastings's relentless campaign against her showed no signs of abating. He began assigning her even more complex cases that required not only skill, but a level of patience that most nurses would struggle to maintain. Althea handled each assignment with care, her movements precise, her focus unwavering. Yet, despite her efforts, Dr. Hastings continued to find fault in everything she did, his criticisms veiled as constructive feedback. That left her feeling demeaned and discouraged. One afternoon, Dr. Hastings approached her with yet another demeaning task. His voice was cold, his expression one of barely concealed disdain, as he handed her a file without meeting her gaze. Althea accepted it, her face impassive, though a flicker of hurt crossed her eyes as she took in his dismissive tone. Mr. Edwards, who had witnessed the exchange from his bed, felt a surge of anger on her behalf. He could no longer stand by as Dr. Hastings continued his relentless attempts to undermine Althea. The injustice of it all, the constant belittling, the whispered remarks from other staff members, was too much to ignore. Mr. Edwards, though confined to his hospital bed, understood that his influence extended far beyond these sterile walls. He was more than just a patient. He held the power to expose the truth. Days passed, each one adding to the mounting tension within the hospital. Althea continued her work, determined to prove herself despite the obstacles Dr. Hastings placed in her path. Her dedication became a silent defiance, an unspoken declaration that she would not be broken by prejudice or bigotry. She drew strength from her mother's legacy, the resilience of those who had come before her, and the knowledge that her work was meaningful, that it served a purpose beyond the confines of Old Dominion. Mr. Edwards, meanwhile, was preparing to take matters into his own hands. He had spent his career in a position of authority, one that afforded him both respect and influence. He understood the weight of responsibility, the duty to speak up against injustice, and he knew that his silence in this situation would be an act of complicity. His observations over the past few days had left him with a clear picture of the hospital's underlying issues, and he was determined to address them. On the morning of his discharge, Mr. Edwards requested a meeting with the hospital administrator, a man named Frank Whitaker. Whitaker, a reserved figure known for his cautious approach, was initially surprised by the request, but agreed to the meeting out of respect for Mr. Edwards' reputation. The conversation took place in a private office, with Whitaker listening intently as Mr. Edwards recounted his experiences and observations. Mr. Edwards spoke with a quiet authority, detailing the prejudice he had witnessed, the dismissive treatment Althea had endured, and the toxic atmosphere that pervaded Old Dominion. His words were measured but firm, each one a pointed critique of the hospital's failure to uphold its standards of professionalism and respect. He highlighted Dr. Hastings's role in fostering this environment, describing the doctor's condescending demeanor and the relentless scrutiny he subjected Althea to. Whitaker listened, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. The weight of Mr. Edwards's words was undeniable, his observations a damning indictment of Old Dominion's culture. As the meeting concluded, Whitaker promised to investigate the matter further, though Mr. Edwards sensed a reluctance in his tone, a hesitation that suggested the administrator's loyalty to the hospital's image over its integrity. Unwilling to rely solely on Whitaker's assurances, Mr. Edwards took additional measures. He contacted colleagues within his network, individuals with influence in Virginia's medical community, and shared his concerns. His reputation lent weight to his words, and soon, whispers of Old Dominion's internal issues began to spread. The hospital, once revered for its standards, now faced scrutiny from those who questioned its commitment to fairness and equality. Meanwhile, Althea remained unaware of the storm brewing around her. She continued her work with the same quiet determination, each day a testament to her resilience. The hostility she faced was unrelenting, the whispers and glances from her colleagues a constant reminder of her outsider status. But she endured, drawing strength from her purpose, her duty to care for her patients despite the challenges she faced. The impact of Mr. Edwards' actions became apparent over the following weeks. The atmosphere within Old Dominion shifted, a subtle yet undeniable change that left staff members on edge. Rumors circulated, hints of an impending investigation that would expose the hospital's hidden flaws. Dr. Hastings, once confident in his authority, now sensed the precariousness of his position, the possibility that his actions could face consequences. Althea, still unaware of the extent of Mr. Edwards' influence, noticed the shift with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She sensed that something was changing, that the silent weight of prejudice that had permeated Old Dominion was beginning to lift. The whispered remarks grew less frequent, the glances less hostile, as though a quiet reckoning was unfolding within the hospital's walls. Then, one day, Althea was summoned to the administrator's office. She entered with a sense of trepidation, unsure of what awaited her. Whitaker greeted her with a solemn expression, his tone measured as he explained the purpose of the meeting. He informed her of the investigation into Dr. Hastings' conduct, the allegations of discrimination and unprofessionalism that had come to light through Mr. Edwards' intervention. Althea listened in stunned silence, her mind reeling as she processed the implications of Whitaker's words. She had endured so much, each slight and dismissal a weight she had carried alone. And now, for the first time, she felt seen, acknowledged in a way that validated her struggle. Mr. Edwards' actions had given voice to the injustices she had faced, exposing the prejudice that had defined her experience at Old Dominion. Whitaker's tone softened as he acknowledged Althea's resilience, her dedication despite the adversity she had encountered. He expressed a commitment to addressing the issues within the hospital, to ensuring that Old Dominion upheld its standards of fairness and respect for all its staff members. It was a small step, but one that held the promise of a better future. As Althea left the administrator's office, a sense of relief washed over her. She had faced countless challenges, each one a test of her strength and resolve, but she had persevered. And now, with Mr. Edwards' support and Whitaker's commitment to change, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face it, determined to build a legacy of resilience and justice within the walls of Old Dominion. In the days following her meeting with Whitaker, Althea noticed a gradual yet undeniable shift in her work environment. The hostility that had once permeated every interaction began to fade, replaced by an atmosphere of cautious respect. Her colleagues, who had once barely acknowledged her presence, now greeted her with polite nods, their tones subdued, their gazes no longer filled with disdain. Though Althea understood that true change would take time, she allowed herself a small sense of accomplishment. Her perseverance, coupled with Mr. Edwards' intervention, had ignited a spark within Old Dominion, one that could no longer be ignored. The whispers that had once been directed at her now circulated around Dr. Hastings. Rumors of the investigation spread among the staff, each retelling adding new layers to the growing scandal. It became clear that Mr. Edwards' influence had extended far beyond the hospital walls. His connections in Virginia's medical community had put Old Dominion under a level of scrutiny it had never experienced before. Dr. Hastings, once untouchable in his position of authority, now found himself under intense scrutiny. Althea observed the shift in Dr. Hastings's demeanor with a mixture of relief and lingering caution. Gone was the man who once exuded a cold, arrogant confidence. In his place stood someone visibly strained, his once unwavering composure cracking under the weight of impending consequences. Each time she passed him in the hallway, she could feel his gaze on her, a bitter resentment emanating from his expression. Though he continued to assign her challenging tasks, his interactions had become restrained, his tone laced with an unspoken frustration that hinted at his growing awareness of his vulnerability. Then one morning, Althea was approached by a nurse named Sarah, who had always been among the more distant of her colleagues. Sarah, a well-established figure in the hospital, had previously sided with Dr. Hastings, often joining in the whispers and sidelong glances that followed Althea through the corridors. But on this day, Sarah's demeanor was different. She hesitated, her expression a mixture of guilt and nervousness, before speaking in a voice just above a whisper. In a halting tone, Sarah acknowledged the way Althea had been treated, her words carrying an undercurrent of regret. She admitted that she, too, had felt pressured by Dr. Hastings's influence, that her behavior had been shaped by the hospital's culture of conformity and silent compliance. Though Althea felt a flash of anger at the admission, she recognized the significance of Sarah's words. For the first time, one of her colleagues had openly acknowledged the prejudice she had endured, breaking the unspoken code of silence that had kept the hospital's issues hidden for so long. Althea accepted Sarah's apology with a quiet nod, though she remained cautious. She understood that true change would require more than apologies. It would demand a fundamental shift in attitudes and behavior, a transformation that would take time and continued effort. But in that moment, she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was up to the hospital's staff to nurture them. The investigation continued over the following weeks, each day bringing new revelations that exposed the depths of Old Dominion's issues. Dr. Hastings's conduct was scrutinized, his actions dissected, as the investigators uncovered patterns of discrimination that extended beyond Althea's experiences. Several other staff members came forward, their testimonies revealing a history of unprofessionalism and prejudice that had permeated the hospital for years. Dr. Hastings's reputation, once impeccable, now lay in tatters. His influence diminished as the truth of his behavior came to light. Throughout this period, Mr. Edwards maintained his quiet support for Althea, his presence a steady reassurance amidst the upheaval. Though he had since been discharged, his influence lingered, a constant reminder to the hospital's administration that he was watching, that he expected real change. His role in initiating the investigation had left an indelible mark on Old Dominion, his actions a testament to the power of accountability in challenging institutional prejudice. The final blow to Dr. Hastings's authority came on a day that would forever alter Old Dominion's course. Althea arrived at work to find the hospital buzzing with activity, staff members huddled in small groups, their conversations hushed yet urgent. News had spread that the investigators had completed their report, their findings a damning critique of Dr. Hastings's conduct and the hospital's failure to address its underlying issues. Althea was summoned to a meeting with Whitaker, who greeted her with a solemn expression. He informed her that the investigation had concluded and that Dr. Hastings would be removed from his position effective immediately. The decision had not come easily, Whitaker admitted, but it was necessary to restore the hospital's integrity and demonstrate a commitment to upholding its standards. He acknowledged Althea's resilience and professionalism, expressing gratitude for her dedication in the face of adversity. Althea listened, her emotions a complex blend of relief, vindication, and lingering apprehension. She had fought so hard, endured so much, and now, at long last, she felt the weight of injustice begin to lift. Dr. Hastings' departure marked a turning point, a moment that signaled a new beginning for Old Dominion, one defined not by prejudice and hostility, but by the possibility of growth and transformation. As she left Whitaker's office, Althea felt a sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction that settled over her like a warm embrace. The journey had been long and arduous, each day a test of her strength and determination. But she had prevailed. her resilience a testament to her mother's legacy, her own unbreakable spirit. In the weeks that followed, Old Dominion implemented a series of changes aimed at fostering a more inclusive and supportive environment. Diversity and inclusion training became mandatory for all staff, and a new committee was formed to oversee the hospital's hiring and promotion practices, ensuring that each decision was guided by principles of fairness and equity. Althea was invited to join this committee, her experiences and insights deemed invaluable in shaping the hospital's future. The transformation was gradual, each step a small but meaningful step toward healing the wounds that had long festered within Old Dominion's walls. The staff, once divided by unspoken biases, began to engage in open conversations, confronting the issues that had previously been swept under the rug. Althea observed these changes with a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. Her own journey a reminder of the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. One year after Mr. That Edwards' intervention, Althea stood before a group of new nurses during orientation. She shared her experiences with them, not to dwell on the past, but to impart a message of resilience and hope. She spoke of the challenges she had faced, the prejudice she had endured, and the strength she had found within herself to overcome them. Her words resonated with the new staff, a reminder that they too carried the power to effect change, to build a hospital that honored its commitment to compassion and respect. In the audience, Sarah, now a trusted colleague and ally, watched with admiration. The journey had transformed them both, shaping their perspectives and strengthening their resolve to uphold the values they now cherished. Althea's legacy had become a cornerstone of Old Dominion's culture. Her story, a beacon of hope and resilience that would inspire generations to come. As Althea concluded her speech, she felt a sense of fulfillment that transcended the trials she had endured. Her journey had been marked by pain and struggle, but it had also brought about growth, healing, and transformation. She had found her place within Old Dominion, not as an outsider, but as a leader, a catalyst for change that would forever alter the course of the hospital's history. And as she looked out at the faces before her, Althea knew that her journey was far from over. The fight for equality, for respect, for justice was ongoing, a battle that would require unwavering commitment and courage. But with each step, she would carry forward the legacy of those who had come before her, and the promise of a brighter, more inclusive future for all.